Why do you keep ending up in the same pain, even after swearing it would be different this time? That's not weakness. It's not failure. It's the hidden architecture of your life. The mental loops you don't question, the silent expectations you still carry, the habits you think are harmless but quietly sabotage you. You're not just repeating actions, you're repeating beliefs, stories, and unexamined hopes. And the cost? Your energy, your peace, your future. This video isn't about motivational hype or chasing perfection. It's about stoic clarity, seeing the loop for what it is, not what you wish it were. It's about confronting the exact moment you usually fall back and doing something different, even if it's small, even if it's uncomfortable. Because real change doesn't shout, it whispers. It begins the moment you stop justifying, stop overthinking, and start choosing differently, one decision at a time. So if you've been stuck in a pattern you can't seem to break, if your mistakes feel less like choices and more like fate, this is the moment to pause. Watch closely, reflect honestly, and start again, this time without illusion. If this speaks to you, stay with us. Subscribe for more practical insights through Stoic philosophy and share your story below. You're not the only one stuck, but you can be the one who steps out. Let's begin. 1. You keep thinking you'll change when you feel ready. The most dangerous lie you tell yourself isn't that you'll never change, it's that you'll change when the time is right. You convince yourself that tomorrow will bring clarity, that motivation will come once things settle, that you just need a little more energy, a little less chaos. But deep down you know that moment never comes. Readiness isn't a feeling. It's not a surge of inspiration or a wave of confidence. It's often disguised as resistance, as hesitation, as that quiet discomfort you keep trying to silence with distractions and delay. And if you're waiting for a clean break between fear and certainty, you'll be waiting for the rest of your life. Because real change doesn't ask for permission, it asks for action in the middle of the unknown. You don't rise because you feel ready. You rise because you're tired of where you are. That's the shift. The discomfort becomes unbearable. The pattern becomes obvious. The repetition starts to feel like erosion, not growth. But that realization alone is not enough. It's what happens next that separates the few who break the loop from the many who stay trapped in it. And that's where philosophy becomes useful. Stoic wisdom doesn't tell you to wait for ideal conditions. It reminds you that control begins when you stop depending on conditions. That the right moment is the one you decide to step forward, not when the storm passes, but when you stop waiting for the sky to clear. Think about a man sitting in his truck outside a gym, engine running. He's 52. His doctor told him 3 months ago that his blood pressure is spiking and his knees won't carry his weight much longer. Every night, he promises himself that tomorrow will be different. But when morning comes, there's always a reason not to go. Too tired, too sore, too late. He scrolls through his phone, he watches a video about morning discipline. He even puts his hand on the door, but he doesn't move. Why? Because he's waiting to feel ready, and readiness never arrives. What's waiting at that gym door isn't certainty. It's doubt, embarrassment, the memory of how out of shape he felt last time. But here's the thing, change doesn't wait for comfort. It grows in discomfort. It begins when he opens the door anyway. Not because he feels strong, but because he's done feeling stuck. This pattern, the loop, it's not about laziness. It's about a mind trained to equate action with ease. You've been taught to wait until you feel aligned, motivated, and confident. But that's not how transformation works. Discipline doesn't bloom after readiness, it builds before it. And the mind follows the body, not the other way around. You don't feel confident, and then you act. You act, and then confidence follows. That's how neuroplasticity works. That's how new patterns are wired. One uncomfortable choice, done consistently, starts to override the old default. Not because it's heroic, but because it's repeated. Stoic philosophy speaks directly to this. Epictetus said, first say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. He didn't say wait until you feel like it. He didn't say to ask for validation first. He said decide and then act. Not in ideal conditions, not when emotions align, but now. In this messy, imperfect, inconvenient moment, because this is all you ever really have. That's why readiness is a trap. It makes you believe you're respecting your own pace when really you're protecting your fear. And what's the cost of waiting? not just time. It's identity erosion. Every time you delay, the version of you that knows better becomes quieter. The version that believes in action gets weaker. You don't just lose momentum, you lose self-trust. And that's harder to rebuild than any habit. So when you think, I'll change when I'm ready, you're not just postponing growth. You're teaching your brain that avoidance is safer than movement. That safety is more important than meaning. But deep down, you want more than safety. You want dignity. You want direction. You want strength, not comfort. So let's make it painfully clear. The right time never comes. What comes is more delay, more numbness, more regret. What you do with this moment right now is what rewrites the loop. And no, it won't feel like a breakthrough. It'll feel like lifting something heavy while tired. It'll feel like silence instead of celebration. But beneath that silence, your mind is watching. And when it sees you choose action over hesitation, over and over, it starts to believe something new. That maybe the old loop isn't stronger than you after all. This is where breaking the loop begins. Not in some massive reinvention, but in the smallest refusal to keep waiting. The moment you stop asking to feel ready and start acting like you're done making the same excuses, you change the direction of your life. One decision doesn't erase the past, but it opens a door that the past has been holding shut. And once it opens, something inside you shifts. Not suddenly, not loudly, but permanently. That's the moment you stop living on delay. That's when readiness, finally, stops mattering. 2. You confuse thinking about change with actually changing. It's easy to believe you're changing when what you're really doing is circling the idea of it. You buy books on personal growth, highlight all the right lines, nod at every podcast quote that hits a nerve, and for a moment, you feel awakened. You feel seen. But awareness isn't transformation, and insight without action is just another way we lie to ourselves. You can spend hours journaling about your emotional patterns, dissecting your habits, mapping out new routines, but if nothing changes when the moment of truth arrives, you're still stuck. The mind loves to understand. It loves clarity. But the body only trusts what you do, and most of us confuse the two. I've been there more times than I care to admit. Years ago, I spent weeks analyzing why I couldn't stay consistent with my routines. I had a color-coded calendar. I read about dopamine cycles and habit loops. I had quotes from Marcus Aurelius taped to my wall. I could explain in detail why my lack of follow-through wasn't laziness. It was neural conditioning, fear of failure, self-sabotage, you name it. I knew everything except how to move differently when the moment came. I thought I was doing the work, but I wasn't. I was preparing to change forever. Until one day I saw the absurdity of it. I was meditating about not meditating, planning a new life while repeating the old one. Real change, I've learned, begins when you stop admiring the idea of growth and start choosing discomfort over control. It doesn't happen on paper. It happens in the moment you want to avoid. The awkward silence you usually fill, the email you finally send, the snack you walk past instead of grabbing. It happens when you stop reaching for the familiar and start building a new groove in the brain. Slowly, awkwardly, with friction. Because that's what it takes to override the loop. Not understanding it better, but doing something different, before you feel ready, before you have a perfect plan, before you've mastered it. We love preparation because it feels safe. It gives us the illusion of control while protecting us from the vulnerability of action. But transformation doesn't happen while you're thinking. It happens while you're trembling, when you're unsure, exposed, and choosing anyway. Stoic philosophy doesn't reward knowledge for its own sake. It demands application. Seneca wrote about how many people waste time by endlessly preparing to live, rather than living. You don't become resilient by knowing the quotes. You become resilient when you practice restraint in traffic, composure in conflict, and presence when you'd rather check out. Stoicism is not intellectual, it's practical. And it's brutally honest. If you're not doing the thing, you haven't changed. That's where so many fall short. You believe your reflection is your transformation. But the truth is, self-awareness without self-mastery is noise. You can't think your way out of patterns you behave your way into. You have to act differently, repeatedly, until the new identity sticks. Otherwise, the brain registers your growth attempts as performance, not pattern. That's why many people feel stuck even after consuming tons of self-help content. They've trained themselves to feel rewarded for insight instead of for action, and that keeps the loop alive. It feels like progress, but it's just polished procrastination. The danger is subtle, because reflecting, journaling, studying, these things are good. They're part of the process, but they are not the process itself. They are fuel. The engine is still moving. Until you take a different action under pressure, you're still building the same self. The loop doesn't care how many tools you've studied. It cares what you do when the old impulse hits. Will you pause? Will you breathe? Will you choose silence over reaction? Stillness over escape? Or will you go through the same motions while convincing yourself that you've grown because you can describe them better? And this distinction matters, not just for your mental clarity, but for your dignity. Because repeating a loop while pretending it's progress chips away at self-trust. You start doubting your own voice. You start questioning your ability to follow through. Not because you're weak, but because you've replaced execution with explanation. And your nervous system knows the difference. So does your life. Look around. What has actually changed? What have you actually done differently, not just understood more deeply? The difference between knowledge and transformation is behavior. And behavior only changes in the now, not in the theory, not in the plan, not in the story you tell yourself about next week. It changes in the next breath, the next choice, the next uncomfortable step. That's where your new life begins. Not on the page, but in the practice. Not in the insight, but in the interruption. So next time you catch yourself feeling proud of how well you understand your patterns, pause. Ask yourself, did I just learn something new, or did I do something new? Only one of those breaks the loop. The other keeps it alive, and dressed in very convincing clothes. 3. You're fighting deep habits with shallow willpower. What you're up against isn't a moment of weakness. It's years of repetition, reinforcement, and reward. And yet, every time you try to break a bad habit, you meet it with nothing more than willpower. You grit your teeth. You say, not today. You push through with tension in your jaw and breath held tight, hoping the craving will pass or the trigger will fade. And for a while, it does. But eventually, the loop wins. Not because you're undisciplined, but because you're playing on the surface of something rooted deep in your nervous system. You don't need to push harder. You need to go deeper. Most people treat habits like they're mental decisions, as if they live only in the brain. But they don't. They live in the body, in the emotional memory that was formed long before you had language to explain it. In the nervous system that flinches or fidgets or scrolls the moment you feel discomfort. The urge isn't just psychological, it's physiological. It's familiar. It feels like safety, and that's why shallow resistance never lasts. Willpower is a matchstick in a storm, strong for a second, but useless when the wind picks up. To change a pattern, you have to meet it at its source, not the surface impulse, but the identity that impulse protects. Because habits aren't just behaviors. They're stories. Stories about who you are, what you expect, and what you deserve. If you reach for food when you feel uncertain, that habit isn't about hunger. It's about comfort. If you lash out when criticized, that reaction isn't just about anger. It's about protection. Behind every habit is a motive, and that motive is usually emotional survival. Until you meet the emotion, the habit will find a new way to express itself, even if you manage to suppress it for a day or two. That's why you can quit drinking and start overspending. Stop scrolling, but start obsessively cleaning. The behavior changes, but the emotional drive underneath remains unaddressed. Stoicism doesn't tell you to suppress those drives. It tells you to become aware of them, to interrogate what you reach for and why, to pause long enough to notice whether what you're about to do is actually what you need or just what you know. That pause is power, but it's only available if you've trained for it. And training doesn't happen in theory. It happens in real time, in real urges, under real pressure. This is where most people get discouraged. They think failure means a lack of strength, but more often it means the lack of structure. Because the deeper the habit, the stronger the system needed to counter it. You don't beat years of repetition with a vague intention and no plan. You need friction-reducing tools, clear environments, accountability, Patterns that replace, not just resist, the old ones. And more than anything, you need to stop framing failure as a flaw in your character and start seeing it as a flaw in your setup. That shift alone changes everything. You can't rely on motivation because motivation is emotional, and emotions are temporary. You can't rely on discipline alone because discipline burns out when the setup stays the same. You need systems, and systems begin by making it harder to default to the loop and easier to choose differently. That might mean changing where you keep your phone at night, changing who you talk to during moments of weakness, changing what you do first thing in the morning. But all of those outer shifts only work if they're connected to an inner shift. The decision to stop depending on force and start building foundations. Stoic practices for stress management were never about being emotionless. They were about being ready. They knew the storm would come. They trained their minds and bodies daily, so when the trigger hit, they didn't need to resist. They responded. And that's the difference. Willpower reacts. Structure prepares. One burns out, the other builds. And you get to choose which one you'll rely on tomorrow. When the craving comes back, when the doubt returns, when the loop tries to pull you in again. What you're trying to overcome is not just a bad habit, it's a learned identity. Something inside you that says, this is how I've always handled stress, boredom, anxiety. And so to change, you don't just need to push harder, you need to teach yourself a new way of being, slowly, repeatedly, not with brute force, but with precision, with awareness, with the environment. With daily rituals that ground your nervous system in a new normal. Over time, that new normal becomes who you are. Not overnight, not all at once, but day by day, pattern by pattern, until the old loop has nothing left to hold on to. And maybe that's the most powerful truth in all of this. You don't need to overpower the old pattern. You only need to stop feeding it. You only need to become someone whose life no longer makes space for it. And that starts with one honest question. What are you building? Willpower or identity? Because only one of them lasts. 4. You don't know what you're actually trying to escape from. You say you're trying to quit the habit. The overthinking, the scrolling, the drinking, the snapping at the people you care about. But the truth is, you're not fighting the behavior. You're dodging the feeling behind it. You think you're avoiding the action, but what you're really avoiding is the emotion. The quiet grief you never processed. The boredom that reminds you your life feels hollow, the shame that whispers you're not enough, the loneliness you carry in silence. Until you name what you're running from, the loop will find a new disguise. You'll change the habit, but not the pain that feeds it. Most people never stop to ask, what emotion am I trying to numb right now? They focus on control, suppress the urge, delay the reaction, replace the snack, lock the phone. But that's surface level. And surface level fixes don't solve root level pain. They rearrange it. They mask it. They move it from one corner of your life to another. You may stop yelling, but you start withdrawing. You stop drinking, but you start obsessing. Because the emotional weight hasn't been released, just relocated. This is why self-discipline alone can't break the loop. Because the loop isn't built on logic, it's built on survival. Somewhere deep in your nervous system, a part of you learned, this is how we cope. This is how we stay safe. And even if that coping mechanism now hurts you, it once served you. It dulled the ache. It distracted you from the truth. And unless you sit still long enough to hear what that part of you is trying to protect, you'll keep sabotaging yourself with habits you claim to hate because they still help you escape what you haven't named. Breaking the loop means breaking the silence. It means telling the truth about what your patterns are really about. Not to shame yourself, but to understand yourself. Not to justify the habit, but to stop being blind to the fear it's masking. Emotional avoidance is the engine of most self-destructive behavior. But the moment you shine light on what you've been unwilling to feel, that's the moment the engine begins to stall. Not because the pain disappears, but because it's finally seen. And when pain is seen, it no longer has to shout. This is where Stoicism offers a different path. Not cold detachment, but grounded clarity. A Stoic doesn't deny their emotion. They examine it. They sit with it. They ask, is this fear valid? Is this story real? They create space between impulse and identity. And in that space, they choose. They don't react, they respond, they don't run, they remain. That's the strength modern life rarely teaches, the ability to stay in discomfort without needing to escape it instantly. And yes, that takes training. Because most of us were never taught how to feel without fixing, how to allow without analyzing. We were told to tough it out, shake it off, distract ourselves, and move on. But feelings don't evaporate just because you ignore them. They go underground. They wait. And then they show up sideways, in your anger, your addiction, your need for control. That's not weakness, that's backlog. Emotional debt you haven't paid, and the interest is collecting. So what do you do instead? You pause, you breathe, you notice the moment the urge rises, and instead of distracting yourself, you ask the question no one taught you to ask. What am I feeling that I don't want to feel? You listen without trying to fix it. You name the emotion with precision. And then, only then do you decide how to respond. Because when you understand the root, you stop fighting the symptom. You start healing the cause. And healing is what truly breaks the loop. This work is not glamorous, it's not fast, it doesn't give you instant wins or public applause, but it gives you something far more powerful: emotional freedom, the ability to stay with your own experience without fear, to meet yourself in moments of pain without reaching for a shortcut. And in that space, you stop being a victim of the past. You become the architect of your future. So the next time you feel the pull to check out, lash out, fall back, don't just ask, how do I stop? Ask why I wanted to escape, and then go to that place with honesty and care. Because the loop only holds power when you refuse to see what's underneath it. But once you see the emotion clearly, once you stop running, you realize there was never anything to fear, only something to feel. And you're strong enough to feel it now. 5. You use guilt to punish, not to grow. Guilt isn't supposed to chain you to your past. It's supposed to wake you up to something you don't want to repeat. It's meant to be a signal, not a sentence. But too often, you turn that signal into a weapon, and you use it on yourself. Not to grow, not to change, but to stay small, to stay stuck, to feel like you're paying a price, even if the debt was cleared long ago. And the worst part is, it feels noble. Self-punishment can disguise itself as responsibility. You think, at least I care. At least I feel bad. But that isn't transformation. That's stagnation dressed as virtue. There was a time I believed guilt was the fuel I needed to change. Every time I broke a promise to myself, I'd sit in it. I'd let the shame linger. I'd repeat the script, how could I mess this up again? I thought if I hurt enough, I'd never do it again. But pain without direction doesn't teach. It just wears you down. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't actually breaking the loop. I was reinforcing it. Because when guilt becomes your identity, the mistake becomes your home. And over time, you stop trying to grow and start trying to survive it. That's how self-sabotage quietly continues. You mess up, then punish yourself for it. And in that punishment, you feel like you're doing something. You feel like guilt is the change. But it's not. It's just the echo of your conscience asking you to respond. Not to retreat, not to collapse, but to act. If you're not using guilt as information, it becomes a trap, a familiar emotional posture that lets you feel remorse while avoiding the discomfort of actual change. Growth doesn't happen through self-hatred. It doesn't come from repeating, I'll never get this right. That's not discipline. That's despair in disguise. Real change requires clarity, not cruelty. It begins when you treat guilt like a compass, one that points to where you strayed, not where you're doomed to stay. But for that to happen, you have to stop interpreting guilt as a moral flaw. You have to start seeing it as an invitation, a moment to pause, reflect, and realign your behavior, not your worth. Stoic philosophy calls for this kind of response. Marcus Aurelius never said, feel worse until you're better. He said, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke. Guilt is the same. The event passed, the action is over. What remains is your estimate of it, the story you've attached to it. And if that story is I'm broken, you'll never allow yourself to grow. But if the story is I strayed from what matters and I can return to it, everything changes. The people who make real progress aren't the ones who feel the most guilt. They're the ones who move through it, they hear it, they honor it, then they get up, They clean up the mess. They take responsibility without self-flagellation. They apologize, they reset, they recommit, they act. And in that process, they begin to build a new association, one where falling short doesn't mean forever, one where guilt becomes the beginning of course correction, not the proof of their unworthiness. You might think staying in guilt is how you show you care. But there's a deeper way to care. Through restoration, not rumination. Through doing something today that breaks the cycle from yesterday. Through choosing not to sit in the emotional ruins of regret, but to use that discomfort to build something stronger. Guilt, used wisely, is one of the most powerful tools we have. But used emotionally without intention, it becomes a leash around the neck of your growth. You're not meant to live inside your mistakes. You're meant to live beyond them. But that only happens when guilt stops being your punishment and starts being your prompt. If you've been stuck in that place, if you've been looping through guilt thinking that pain equals progress, it's time to ask yourself a harder question. Is this helping me change, or is it just keeping me busy feeling bad? Because if it's the latter, you're not healing. You're hiding. The truth is, guilt isn't proof that you're a bad person. It's proof that you still remember your standard, that you still care, and that care is precious. Don't waste it on cycles that never end. Use it to walk out of them, with purpose, with presence, with a quiet refusal to live small just because you slipped. Mistakes aren't the enemy. Staying there is, and you are not here to stay in that place. You're here to move forward, starting now. 6. You forgive yourself too quickly without learning the lesson. There's a kind of self-forgiveness that heals, and then there's the kind that hides. You mess up, you feel the sting, you tell yourself it's okay, I'm only human, and you move on. But nothing changed. The behavior stays. The loop resets, and the next time it happens, you do the same. Again and again. Not because you're weak, but because you've been taught that forgiveness is the end of the process, when in truth, it's only the middle. Skipping the reflection, skipping the responsibility, skipping the pause where the pain becomes wisdom. That's how the cycle stays alive, wrapped in gentle words that sound like growth, but only keep you comfortable. Real forgiveness isn't relief, it's recognition. It doesn't let you off the hook, it puts you back on the path. It says, I see what happened, I see what it costs, and I will not pretend it didn't matter. Too many people use self-forgiveness as a shortcut. They want to feel better now, not wiser later. They mistake emotional comfort for transformation. And the danger in that is subtle but deep. Because when you don't stop long enough to ask, why did I do that again? You're not learning. You're just resetting. You're just telling your nervous system it's fine to go back to sleep. But growth demands that you stay awake, that you stay present with what just happened, not to judge yourself, but to investigate. What was I thinking when I made that choice? What emotion was I avoiding? What lie did I believe in that moment? These are the hard questions, and they only emerge in stillness, in that uncomfortable space between failure and forgiveness, where most people rush to escape. But that space is sacred, because that's where understanding lives. That's where the loop breaks. Not in the apology, not in the second chance, but in the decision to stop pretending that a kind word to yourself is enough to build a new life. Stoic philosophy speaks directly to this. The Stoics weren't harsh, but they were honest. They didn't believe in wallowing, but they also didn't believe in skipping steps. If you wronged yourself or someone else, you were to make it right, not just emotionally, but practically. Reflect, rectify, reset, but never rush past it just because you're uncomfortable. That discomfort is useful. That discomfort is information. It's the weight that makes the next step count. Without it, you float. And floating is just drifting in disguise. I once had a pattern I couldn't break. I'd promise to start something, get 2 days in, quit quietly, and then whisper to myself, it's okay, next time. And I meant it. I didn't think I was lying, but it wasn't really forgiveness I was practicing. It was avoidance in a softer tone. And the truth hit hard one morning when I realized every "it's okay" had become an excuse. Not an acknowledgement of humanness, but a way to skip the consequence of not showing up. And when you skip consequences, you skip character. You rob yourself of the very thing you're trying to build. That's why forgiving yourself too quickly is not self-love. It's self-sabotage in disguise. Love would ask more of you. Love would say, I see your mistake, and I believe you're strong enough to face it fully. To not flinch, to not minimize, to not wrap it in spiritual language or mindset tricks. Just to look at it head on and say, this happened, I own it, and now I choose differently. That's what builds integrity. That's what builds real freedom. The kind that doesn't come from pretending you're over it, but from walking through it with your eyes open. So the next time you feel the urge to move on quickly, stop. Don't stay in shame, but don't sprint to relief either. Sit, ask, listen. Let the discomfort tell you what it needs to. Let the reflection show you what the habit has been trying to hide. Only then, after clarity, should you forgive. Not to forget, but to realign. Not to escape, but to return stronger. That's what true self-respect looks like. Not avoiding your flaws, but facing them with the dignity of someone who knows they're capable of more. And if you've rushed through this step before, it's okay. This is your moment to stop the pattern. Not through more punishment, not through delay, but through a slower, wiser kind of forgiveness. The kind that says, I will not forget what this cost me. I will not ignore what this showed me. I will take it seriously, because I take my future seriously. That's the moment you shift from resetting to rebuilding. That's the moment you stop living in circles. That's the moment forgiveness becomes strength, not softness. And you move forward with something deeper than comfort. Conviction. 7. You don't track or measure what you're trying to improve. You say you want to grow, but how do you know if you actually are? Without tracking, everything you're working toward lives in the realm of guesswork. You feel like you're changing, until one hard day knocks you back and you realize you've built nothing solid, only hopes and impressions. And when change has no proof, failure becomes inevitable. Because in the absence of clarity, your mind defaults to criticism. You assume nothing's working. You convince yourself you're wasting your time, but you're not failing, you're just blind. And blindness makes every small step feel like standing still. The human mind craves closure. It wants to see movement. That's why we check progress bars, track workouts, review numbers, and crave feedback. It's not vanity, it's vision. It gives us a reference. It gives us structure. It tells us whether to keep going or course correct. Yet when it comes to personal change, mindset, habits, emotion, discipline, we throw that principle out the window. We try to be better without defining what better means. We work on ourselves without asking how we'll know when the work is working. And that leaves us exhausted, not from the effort, but from the uncertainty. Progress needs feedback. Stoic thinkers understood this long before productivity apps existed. Marcus Aurelius journaled not for expression, but for examination. He wrote to himself daily about who he had been, who he was becoming, and where the gap lived between those two. He tracked the soul, not just the schedule, because growth without reflection is motion without direction. And without direction, the loop continues. You repeat what you don't measure. If you want to break the loop, you have to get specific. Not about the grand goals, but about the micro behaviors. What time did you wake up today? How long did you sit before reacting? What emotion triggered your relapse? What decision, seemingly small, pulled you back into the old self? You won't catch these patterns if you don't look for them. And you won't look for them if you don't build the habit of writing them down, naming them, bringing them into the light. Because the problem isn't just a lack of discipline. It's a lack of data. You say your mornings are getting better, but are they? You say you're working on your mindset, but how? You say you're more resilient now, but compared to what? Vague intentions don't produce real results, but clear metrics, even crude ones, do. They anchor your growth in reality. They create tension between what you say and what you do. And that tension, if faced with honesty, leads to alignment. But only if you're willing to look. Tracking isn't perfectionism. It's awareness. It's not about being obsessed with numbers or micromanaging your life. It's about refusing to let your future rely on memory, mood, or motivation. Because those things lie. They shift. But the paper doesn't. The journal doesn't. The log on your phone doesn't. When you see it, truly see it, you can't lie to yourself anymore. And that's where transformation starts, in the loss of your favorite excuses. I used to say I was working on patience, that I was getting better at staying calm. But then I started writing down how many times I reacted without pause each day. And the truth was uncomfortable. I wasn't improving. I was just becoming more articulate about why I wasn't. Once I saw the pattern, I could shift it. Not overnight, but gradually. Because when the data showed I was still snapping on Tuesdays after work, or still anxious before client calls, I could adjust. I could prep better. I could breathe sooner. I could build systems, not just set hopes. That's the difference tracking makes. Without it, everything feels random. And when things feel random, your nervous system gives up. Why try if you can't tell what's working? But when you see even a small improvement, something inside you lights up. You begin to trust the process. You begin to trust yourself. And that trust compounds. It becomes momentum. And momentum, more than motivation, is what makes the loop crack. So ask yourself, what are you tracking right now? What numbers reflect your values? What actions reflect your growth? What decisions can you see written in front of you that say, I showed up again today? If your answer is vague, your progress will be too. But if your answer is clear, your power multiplies. Because feedback creates clarity. And clarity makes quitting harder, not because you feel more inspired, but because you finally see where the real shifts are happening. Or not. You don't need more goals, you need more honesty. You don't need to work harder, you need to track better. Not to impress anyone, not to create pressure, but to give your effort a mirror so you can see it, adjust it, and grow from it. That's how you exit the loop. Not with willpower, but with truth. Measured, recorded, and used. Quietly, daily, precisely. Because a life examined is a life you can actually change. 8. You're waiting for the perfect moment that never comes. You tell yourself you'll start when the timing's better, when the stress dies down, when work calms, when the kids are older, when you finally feel like yourself again. You wait for motivation to return, for clarity to hit, for the emotional fog to lift. But it never does. At least not all at once. And so another day slips by. Not because you chose to stay the same, but because you waited for life to make changing easier. And it won't. It never does. Because the perfect moment is a myth, a polished excuse wearing the mask of logic. Change doesn't begin when everything aligns. It begins in chaos, in discomfort, in the raw, ordinary now. It begins when nothing feels ready, and you move anyway. Waiting makes you feel responsible. It sounds wise, strategic, but it's hesitation in disguise. And the more you let that voice win, the one that says, tomorrow will be better, next week I'll be stronger, the deeper the loop embeds itself. Because that voice isn't just delaying action, it's reinforcing inaction. It teaches your nervous system that movement only comes with comfort, that progress waits on perfection. And the cost? Years of potential. Gone. The Stoics never spoke of waiting for readiness. They acted in alignment with their principles, regardless of their circumstances. Epictetus didn't say, wait until you feel like enduring. He said, endure now. Marcus Aurelius didn't say, meditate once Rome settles down. He wrote in the margins of war. The power of Stoicism lies in its defiance of comfort. Its insistence that your response is always available, even when your energy isn't. Especially when it isn't. The modern world has made waiting a default. We've turned preparation into a profession. We design, optimize, plan, but forget to begin. We scroll through productivity hacks, hoping one will finally unlock action. But nothing unlocks action like action. And the longer you wait for the right moment, the harder it becomes to recognize that it was never coming. You miss it. Not because it wasn't there, but because it didn't look like what you expected. You thought it would feel inspiring, clear, clean. But real change is messy. It interrupts, it drags you in. And if you wait for peace, you'll never find strength. Ask yourself, right now, what are you putting off that you already know matters? What goal, what shift, what truth are you waiting to face once things feel better? And what if this is as ready as it gets? Not perfect, not ideal, but real, and right in front of you. Because here's what waiting does. It robs the present of its power. It convinces you that now isn't enough, when in fact, now is the only time the loop can actually be broken. You don't shift patterns by dreaming about a fresh start. You shift them by disrupting the old one today. Not tomorrow. Not when you feel more energized, more confident, more supported. But now in the exact state you're in. Tired, doubtful, but willing. That willingness is the real signal that you're ready. Not the motivation, not the mood, the willingness to act with a guarantee. That's what builds a new identity. That's what rewires the nervous system. That's what Stoic clarity demands. Not grand gestures, but repeated refusals to delay. When you wait, you hand your agency to your environment. You say, I'll change, but only if the world cooperates. And the world rarely does. So you stay the same. And even though you hate it, you make peace with the loop, because it's familiar. Because it hurts less than stepping into the unknown. But comfort never offers growth. It only offers repetition. And you weren't born to repeat. You were built to rise through the tension, through the resistance, through the inconvenient now. So next time the voice tells you to wait, pause. Not to agree, but to confront. Ask it what it's protecting. Ask it if the delay has ever paid off before. And then, act. However small. One decision, one disruption, one step that reminds your body you don't need the perfect moment. You just need the present one. Claimed, owned, and used. The loop feeds on delay. But momentum begins with interruption. Not when it feels easy. Not when the stars align. But when you choose discomfort over drift, now, not later. That's the moment the pattern breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in your refusal to wait one more day for a life that won't begin itself. You don't need another book, another breakthrough, or another burst of motivation. You need one honest moment. The moment where you stop lying to yourself about why you haven't changed. The loop doesn't break when you feel ready. It breaks when you're willing to see what's real. To pause, to ask better questions, to act when it's inconvenient. Growth begins with clarity, not comfort. You can't outthink a habit built on emotion. You can't escape patterns if you keep rushing past the pain that fuels them. And you can't build a new life if you keep forgiving yourself too soon just to feel better. Real discipline isn't about punishment, it's about paying attention. Stoic resilience doesn't wait for the right moment. It creates it. One choice, one change, one day at a time. So ask yourself, which of these patterns is yours? Which excuse do you still protect? Which part of you is quietly asking for more? The loop ends the moment you listen and act differently. If any part of this spoke to something buried deep inside you, share your story in the comments below. You never know who else is trying to break the same pattern and needs to see they're not alone. The time is not later, it's now.